Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Always excited to have a third time appearance on the show. Ryan Craig is going to earn his Trending in Ed refrigerator magnet. Ryan is the managing director of Achieve Partners, and he's the author of the new book, Apprentice Nation. We'll get into all that in a bit, but before we do any of that, Ryan, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Wow, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be a third-time guest.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
what a delight. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. And your book is hot off the presses. It's a really interesting read or listen, as I happen to be a bit of an audiophile. So I did listen to your book. A lot in there, a lot of stuff that makes it engaging. There's some interesting stories and pop culture references, which is part of what really captures my imagination as a reader or a listener. But can you catch folks up? We'll include links to your previous appearances. So maybe we could do like a short version of who you are and how you got to
Sure.
this point in your career.
Yeah, super. So I run Achieve Partners, which is a private equity fund in the education and workforce sector. We have two strategies. One is an ed tech strategy. So we buy and grow ed tech companies that sell into higher ed and K-12. And then we have a workforce strategy where what we do is we look for sectors of the economy where there's a talent gap. And we look for companies that could become platforms for solving that problem.
Mhm.
And we acquire them and essentially build large apprenticeship programs so they can become engines for new talent in their sectors like software development, data analytics, cybersecurity, Salesforce, Workday,
Mhm.
healthcare IT, a range of healthcare services fields. So we're actually, I'm not just writing about the problem. We're actually solving the problem. And some of the examples in the book are actually taken from our portfolio
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah, and it's a fun read, a fun listen, and it is interesting also your evolution over time where there was more of a focus on higher ed as perhaps the pathway, and now this book, which is Apprentice Nation. Spoiler alert, the punchline here, the big finish is that apprentices and apprenticeship is a model that needs to be more fully adopted here in the US. I was surprised how under-resourced apprenticeships are in the US. That's almost like a dirty little secret, almost the flip side of the level to which we're over supporting our current higher ed model. I learned that very much through your stuff here, but can you spell that out a little more for our listeners?
Yeah. If you think about apprenticeship, you probably think about the construction trades, welders and electricians and folks who, come and build and repair your house. And that's about right. We have about 500,000 apprentices in the country, and that represents 0.3% of our workforce.
Hmm.
But pretty much every other developed country is doing much better than we are. You won't be surprised to hear that Germany, Austria, Switzerland do 15 times better. So instead of 0.3% of the workforce, it's 3 to 4.5% of the workforce
Mhm.
in those countries. But Canada, Australia, the UK, France are all doing 5 to 10 times better than we are.
Yeah.
And a generation ago, that wasn't the case. A generation ago, those countries' apprenticeship was small and mostly in the construction trades as it is today. But 70% of the US apprentices today are in the building or construction
Yeah.
trades. And so really the animating question for the book is why? why why are they doing so much better than we are? And why is it important?
Right. And it was interesting going all the way back to the roots of our country where apprenticeship was very baked into the society that our founders lived in. Many of them, Washington apprenticed as a surveyor. Franklin was also an apprentice. That was very much part of our culture. And then it sort of drifted. Can you walk us through what's happened in the US over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. So really since World War II, we focused on college as the pathway to economic opportunity in this country. And college for all worked for a while. It worked until tuition, grew to 20, 30, 40, 50, $60,000 a year.
Right.
And even that would have been okay if everyone was graduating into a, $60,000 a year plus job.
Right.
But first of all, 40 to 50% of those who matriculate into a degree program don't complete.
Hmm.
And of those who complete, about 40% who complete are graduating into underemployment, which means that only a distinct minority of those who make the decision to enroll in a college or university is actually achieving a positive outcome,
Mhm.
at least immediately,
Right.
which when you have student loan debt immediately matters. You have loans to repay. So that's really the challenge that we're seeing. And add to that the fact that what's really behind a lot of that underemployment is the digital transformation of the economy
Right.
that colleges, have kept up with in a sense. I mean, there's a lot that happens in colleges that is digital, but if you look at the curriculum and the programs of study, they're largely unchanged from where they were a generation or even two generations ago. And students aren't getting any coursework or experience on the specific digital skills or platforms that employers are increasingly looking for.
Yeah.
So, and then in addition to that skills gap, we're seeing a growing experience gap where employers are asking in jobs that used to be entry level jobs for college graduates, they're asking for 3, 6, 12 months plus work experience,
Right.
either explicitly in the job description or implicitly. And, I think AI is likely to turn that experience gap that we're already seeing into something of a chasm,
Right.
right? You think about your first, good job where the bargain was you do quite a lot of grunt work or menial work and you
Right.
kind of learn the ropes. AI is going to eliminate much of that grunt work or menial work so that employers are going to expect you to be able to do higher value work from the get go. And
Hmm.
they're going to require experience to do that.
Right.
I look at cybersecurity as sort of the paradigmatic example. A decade ago, a college graduate with some technical chops could get a job is a tier one analyst in a security operations center, first row of defense, looking at alerts coming in, deciding which you can resolve yourself, which you need to elevate or escalate, and which you can disregard. Today, those tier one jobs are largely gone. The entry level jobs in security operations center, thanks to automation and digital transformation, are
Hmm.
what used to be called the tier two jobs, where they demand a CISSP certification, which is explicitly 3 to 5 years work experience. So the entry level in cybersecurity has become something of an oxymoron. And what automation and digital transformation has done to entry level jobs in cyber, I'm afraid generative AI is going to do to entry level jobs across the economy. And so, if there's one thing that your listeners take away from this, it's that given the change and pace of change of technology, colleges and universities that, unless you're a top 20 brand, if you want to continue to attract students, you're going to need to figure out some way to give your students real relevant work experience as part of their program of study. So when they graduate or when they're actually looking for that first good job, they have relevant work experience.
Hmm.
And apprenticeship, in my mind, is the best way to do that because an apprenticeship is a job
Right.
where you're hired without needing the specific skills or experience because that's what the apprenticeship delivers to you. So it's really another way of saying pathway. We need millions more pathways for young people,
Right.
right? Apprenticeship's not the only way to solve that problem. You can imagine a world where every college looks like a Northeastern or a Drexel with a
Right.
formal co-op program where every
Hmm.
student gets, multiple in-field paid internships.
Yeah.
You can imagine a world where every school is a big user of a work integrated learning platform like Ripen, where faculty members are selecting real work experiences and real work projects from
Right.
real employers and integrating them as capstone experiences in their courses. But it's still not as good as apprenticeship. I've seen lots of entry level job descriptions that ask for experience and say internships don't count. So, I'm not defending employers. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, we send our children into the labor market we have, not the one we might, wish for.
Yeah.
And then if you look at sort of where we are as a nation in terms of investment, as you highlighted at the top,
Yeah.
investment in earn and learn versus investment in, tuition based or what you might pejoratively call debt based career launch
Right.
infrastructure. Pretty much every other developed country is an order of magnitude or two higher on their investment in earn and learn than we are. So we've really gone all in. And I think that's part of the problem is there hasn't been a clear alternative. My last book, A New You, Faster and Cheaper Alternatives to College was kind of 5 years ago, a guided tour of this new emerging last mile training landscape of boot camps and income
Yeah.
share programs and so forth. And I just touched briefly on apprenticeship, but I've come to the conclusion that apprenticeship is really the best way to solve this problem because it's the only pathway that truly levels the playing field for everyone and for the students we should most care about, underrepresented, low income, first generation, English as a second language students, because an apprenticeship is unlike every other pathway or training program. It's a job.
Right.
It's a job that pays a living wage. And so there's no one who can't access an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is the job you want and it doesn't end,
Right.
right? That's another big difference between apprenticeship and internship. An internship is a temporary work experience you'll pursue during your program of study. And then you'll go back and you'll finish your degree or program.
Right.
An apprenticeship is a job that you'll start and you may never end because you just complete your apprenticeship and you just become a regular old employee
Yeah.
of the company.
Yeah. It reminds me of, Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, the whole
Mhm.
paradigm
Yeah,
shift. It
paradigm. Yep.
does seem like you're arguing for a paradigm shift, but that's also why there's so much perhaps resistance where a lot of the existing structures and paradigms that are out there are resistant to change. I'd be curious how you see this playing forward. Like, is it a incremental thing, or do you think there is some foundational shift, perhaps driven by some of the job dynamics and future of work stuff that you're touching on? It does feel like we can goof around a little bit until stuff gets real. And it does feel like we're about to hit some really challenging labor dynamics, demographic dynamics. Can you map a little bit of that out for us?
Yeah, look, I think there are a number of paradigms that are in flux here. One is the notion of digital transformation in higher education, where, a decade or two ago, you might say, the internet's going to change everything about
Mm.
higher education. And, we saw how much it did or didn't change it during COVID when we went to Zoom school.
Right.
And then it bounced right back to looking, very much like it looked 10 or 20 years ago. And, my answer is, yeah, digital transformation is going to fundamentally transform post-secondary education in this country, but only in an indirect way, which is to say, going to transform the jobs that, graduates are looking to attain. By so doing, transform, their students' preferences and sort of the risk return calculus as they think about enrolling in, risky programs in terms of cost and in terms of employment outcomes.
Right. Right.
So that's one paradigm shift. Another paradigm shift is that, we have this paradigm of high school to college to work. And increasingly, like up until a year or two ago, we were at the lowest, younger worker employment rate ever in this country because of the college for all mentality. High school students been told, paid work doesn't matter.
Mm.
Don't take the job as a busboy in a restaurant. Do that 2-week volunteer experience. Try to save the Costa Rican rainforest so you can write about it on your college
Yeah.
admissions essay.
Yeah.
So, we have this paradigm that you really don't, need to worry about paid work until you're about to graduate from college.
Hmm.
Maybe not even then, because you'll go get a master's degree.
Right.
But I think part of the problem is that, high school graduates are confronted with this, terrible choice for many, many young people, which is college or Chipotle,
Right.
right? Do you want to, do you want to go to college? And if you don't want to go to college, you'll work Chipotle,
Right.
which is not quite accurate because something like 40% of, Gen Z think that they can make a career as a social media influencer
Sure.
or playing esports. But if you
Yeah.
take those out, then it's really college or Chipotle, which is, a choice that the college choice is risky and the Chipotle choice seems like it's a, kind of a road to nowhere.
Right.
So we're envisioning a world where we have as many apprentice jobs as there are places in freshman classes
Yeah.
across the country and apprentice jobs across the economy. No
Mm.
matter what you're interested in doing, there are apprenticeships available. And what I'm saying is not that those apprentices won't go to college or won't have any post-secondary education. What I'm suggesting is that we can restage how we consume post-secondary education, because I think a lot of the challenges we have around completion and employment outcomes really stem from the fact that we have this thing that I call information asymmetry, which is to say, you enroll in University of X. University of X has seen 100 students like you over the years and either knows or should know whether you're likely to be successful in your intended program of study. But you have no earthly idea whether you're likely, you hope for the best, but we know that particularly for those students we should care most about, that many of them don't succeed. And yet University of X continues to take your money. You take on that debt to pay the tuition and room and board and fees, and it's not working. So we need more of a fair information fight. And one way to do that is disclosure, which is kind of where the Biden administration is heading. So, a year from now, if you want to enroll in George Washington University's master's degree program, you may have to sign a waiver saying, you've been presented the numbers, you recognize they don't pencil out, but you're enrolling anyway. So that's one way to do it. I think a better way to do it is to provide millions of, good job options for young Americans. Those could be apprenticeships, or those could be something along the lines of what, Chipotle and other large employers of frontline workers are building today, which is these near apprenticeship or sort of enterprise pathways
Right.
that we're seeing, where it's really just companies like Guild that are
Yep.
building those, where it's no longer just an off the shelf online degree that's, going to keep you occupied in that, burrito making job, but it's a skill-based pathway, a
Mhm.
combination of discrete skill-based modules that can take you from burrito maker to junior data analyst
Right.
in an 18-month period. And, it's a program that's connected up with the HRIS. So the hiring manager for those junior data analyst jobs is aware, as you're coming through the system and encouraging you to apply
Yeah.
for that job. Now, that's not quite an apprenticeship because it's not the same job. You have to apply for a new job, but it does represent economic mobility within that enterprise. So if we can do that, if we can create millions of new apprentice jobs, and every frontline worker has at least an option for mobility within the enterprise, then I think what we can have is, millions of young people who are, heading off to college because there's no other option today, will be able to work for a few years, demonstrate to themselves that they're capable of supporting themselves, get a better sense of their interests and capabilities, and make a much more informed decision in a year or two or three as to what post-secondary institution and program they want to pursue. Be more of a fair information fight
Mhm.
in that way. I point to master's degrees. You don't hear too much about, millions of people making bad decisions about master's degrees. And the reason for that is because they're older and they already have bachelor's degrees
Right.
and they're more informed. They're better, consumers of
Mhm.
post-secondary education. So I think we would go a long way to solving many of the problems that we're facing in higher ed if we could, begin to flip that paradigm around, or at least provide an option. So it
Yeah.
doesn't just have to be high school to college to work. It can be high school to work and then to college.
Yeah. Well, and then also the thing that I thought was interesting in the book is that the jobs that are out there require skills and competencies that aren't taught in higher ed either. The example of Salesforce administration and being able to work in HubSpot or doing the types of things that a typical entry level marketer or ops person would just be able to use some of these softwares, at least understand that that's the nature of their job. That was eye-opening to me, and that was a place where it doesn't seem like higher ed is going to respond quickly enough, which is why it does feel like a lot of things are kind of pushing towards an alternative model, pushing us towards something more like apprenticeships.
Yeah, I mean, even if they did respond quicker, a lot of those skills are harder to learn in a classroom than they are by doing.
Right.
Right? You can become trained as a newly minted trailhead Salesforce administrator, but not too many companies are going to be excited to hire you if you've never actually worked
Right.
as a Salesforce administrator. And so that's what I mean about, making sure that graduating students have some real relevant work experience. The experience gap in many ways is about to overshadow the skills gap as the, sort of number one barrier to employment.
Yeah.
And we know if you're underemployed in your first job, two-thirds of the time you're underemployed 5 years later, half the time you're underemployed
Right.
a decade later. And that, frankly, is what's driven this whole student loan forgiveness movement over the last decade,
Mhm.
right? Like, if we didn't have these problems, like I said, if everyone graduated into a, good $60,000 a year job,
Right.
this administration has been, almost to the exclusion of everything else focused on student loan forgiveness. That is a function of this broken market
Right.
we have. We really have, a situation where career launch is, nearly broken in this country, particularly for those, young people we should care most about. And that's
Right.
why, when I was doing my book tour in the fall, I would often start the presentation by putting up a slide of this guy named Oliver Anthony, who's this Virginia singer-songwriter who last summer had this hit song called Rich Men North of Richmond, which basically just talked about how hard it was for young people. The only jobs open and available to me are these crappy dead end jobs.
Right.
And I'm, working my butt off, but I can't seem to get ahead. That's really part of the problem. And I think that's really what animates a lot of the frustration that we see in the country, both socially and politically. And so, I think an apprentice nation, a world where, apprenticeship is truly an option, not just for, high school grads, but also for college grads, or even for, people, older Americans seeking to reenter the workforce.
Right. Right.
Uh, it would be a phenomenal thing. All you need to do is take a job in, whether it be cybersecurity or healthcare IT or whatever, and you're going to gain those skills and or experiences. And, it's suddenly this, bright, shining, dynamic digital economy is within reach. It's not,
Right.
something that only rich men north of Richmond can access.
Absolutely. And then the other piece that I thought was interesting, you mentioned it earlier, is thinking about artificial intelligence and the future of work. The nature of the stuff that humans are expected to do will be changing. And you're working very closely, investing in companies that are doing this type of upskilling work. That's the other component to this where, you're very much focused on the intermediaries and sort of how do we sort of build the supporting ecosystem that allows us to affect a little bit of this paradigm shift that we're looking for.
Right. So in terms of how to build the apprenticeship, what I would say is that I've been running around the country speaking about this for the last 4 months or so, and everyone agrees on the strategy. And it's just a question of the tactics, how we do it. And what we've learned from other countries is, and this is sort of the, if you take, one thing from this podcast, it's that we need more experience in our work experience in our educational pathways. If you take two things, it's that apprenticeships don't build themselves and employers don't just create them because they're, more farsighted or more benevolent. That's not,
Right.
why they're successful in Germany. That's not why, the building trades have apprenticeship programs here. Apprenticeships work and thrive and grow where there are ecosystems of intermediaries that actually do the work, do the heavy lifting of setting up and building and running these programs.
Right.
In Germany, it's large chambers of commerce that are actually required to do so by law. So
Mm.
it's not that Volkswagen and, other German companies are, doing it themselves. It's being done by chambers of commerce largely in partnership with unions for the benefit of employers and the apprentices. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of support from the government to do it. The UK and Australia, a generation ago, they recognized they didn't have that infrastructure. And so what they did is they made the funding available and intermediaries basically came to the table. Staffing companies, HR, services businesses, nonprofits got into the game of being apprenticeship service providers because there was funding.
Mhm.
And every time you hire and train an apprentice, you got paid.
Right.
We don't have that at all here. You can register your apprenticeship program. You can hire and train 1,000 apprentices, and there's no funding that flows immediately or automatically or formulaically in the US. And so we've been doing it wrong. Part of the problem is that from a policy standpoint, we think about apprenticeship like we think about other workforce development or training program. So it's in that same bucket. It's being funded out of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, WIO, which is, apprenticeship and then a big number of low performing training programs for low skilled workers. And no other developed country does that. They all view and fund apprenticeship differently because it is different because it's not a training program. It's a job first
Right.
and foremost that has training built in. And apprenticeship creation is really all about figuring out who's going to employ this unproductive worker for a period of time.
Mhm.
And the answer in other countries is typically intermediaries are going to
Right.
do that work because they're getting paid to do it. So, we have this growing ecosystem of intermediaries here represented by this new organization, Apprenticeships for America. So groups you've probably heard of like Year Up and Apprenti and Multiverse and Reviture and Skillstorm and Optimum and Cloud for Good. These are sort of the new intermediaries that are doing that work, but with a handful of exceptions, there's no public support for them today. So for example, when Multiverse in the UK tries to sell Barclays on an apprenticeship program, it's totally turnkey for Barclays. All Barclays needs to do is put that Multiverse apprentice on their payroll at the lower apprentice wage. Multiverse basically does the rest.
Mm.
And all of the work that Multiverse does is essentially paid for by the government.
Mhm.
Here, when Multiverse tries to, sell an apprenticeship program to Citibank, they have to, it's the same deal, but Multiverse has to charge them $15,000 per apprentice. That's the program fee.
Right.
So as you might imagine, that's a pretty strong inhibitor to apprenticeship growth. And so that's the big difference. I'm convinced that if we can actually begin to, get our funding on par with other developed countries for earn and learn, increase it by an order of magnitude or two.
Right.
And, like the UK, for example, at its peak, it was literally 100 times more on a per capita basis for earn and learn than we're currently spending. So instead of 400 million, more like 40 billion for apprenticeship. that would get us to where we need to go.
And in the successful examples, whether it's Germany or Austria or Australia, UK, are they similarly investing in higher ed, or is this a bit of a zero sum game where you draw down a little bit of the over subsidizing of higher ed to allow more funding to flow to apprenticeships? How does that typically
I think it should
shake
flow
out?
with the student. I mean, I think it should flow with the individual, right? I mean, we basically have formula funding for higher ed today in the
Yep.
form of federal student aid. So let the students decide, right? If the student would prefer to, pursue an earn and learn pathway, we
Yeah.
should fund it.
Right. And is there any language leadership stuff here? Is it just that apprenticeship doesn't hit with the TikToks and the Switch kids nowadays playing
No, it
their
does.
yeah,
That I think is not right. It's people who think that the problem is somehow that apprenticeship doesn't appeal to young people. We know when we launch an apprenticeship program in cybersecurity or Workday, we have hundreds and hundreds of applicants for every open seat. So you're basically telling someone, we're going to give you a pathway to a six-figure job in 4 or 5 years. And we're not asking for skills or experience off the bat. We're asking for potential. We're asking for, interest level. We're often asking for diversity.
yeah.
Um,
And you
uh,
get paid while you do it.
and basically it's in terms of seat time, it's like the equivalent of a master's degree that we're paying you for as
Yeah.
opposed to you paying us. So as you might imagine, it's a lot of interest in that. So look, make no mistake, there are apprenticeships in the trades where, those programs have trouble filling their seats, but I've never seen a case of a new collar or white collar apprenticeship program struggle to find a talent
Right.
apprentices. They're always extremely selective.
Right.
So in my mind, this is a very simple question. It's how do we build that infrastructure of apprenticeship programs and apprentice jobs so that we can go from 500,000 to 2 million to 5 million over the next decade and have as many options for young people. So you can imagine a world where a high school senior is sitting with her guidance counselor, looking at the dozen different university programs that she might be interested in and looking at an equal number of earn and learn pathways that she might pursue. And what's interesting is there's a place where that's happening today, and that's the UK, where last fall, for the first time, UCAS, which is effectively the common app of the UK, began listing apprenticeship programs alongside all the university programs so that you really could sort of compare side by side.
Yeah. And maybe that's the information symmetry and transparency that you're really advocating for. It does feel like what I encounter when I'm talking about the skills gap or now the experience gap is that there is the training element, but it's more of an awareness problem to begin with, where folks just don't understand that there's needs, there's jobs that can be filled, and then really what the pathway is into those jobs. All this is covered in depth in addition to references to Real Genius, men's synchronized swimming, and an ill-fated dirigible accident in Hell's Kitchen. It's all outlined in Ryan's new book, Apprentice Nation. We're getting close to time, Ryan. It's always fun to have you on, and congrats on the refrigerator magnet. But as we're wrapping up here, is there anything we didn't get to? Anything you want to make sure our listeners are thinking about or are aware of as they head back to the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of people who are focused on trying to make this happen. For example, the Department of Labor last month just came up with 800 pages of new rules and regulations that would make it much harder
Yeah.
to launch an apprenticeship program. So it's kind of two steps forward, one step back. But I think the direction of travel is clear. And as I said, as I've been traveling around the country, pretty much everyone agrees, except for maybe some faculty members
Right.
I've spoken to who are, either graduated in a different era, different economy, or never had to worry about, making money or launching their careers.
Right.
So, I'm convinced this is right and it's going to happen. There's a lot of folks in DC and elected officials who were
Yeah.
excited about this.
Yeah.
So if the bureaucrats can get out of the way, we can make an Apprentice Nation a reality.
Good stuff here with Ryan Craig, the managing director of Achieve Partners. He's also the author of Apprentice Nation, and the newsletter is Gap
The
Letter. Is that correct?
Gap letter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gapletter.com.
Yeah. Every 2 weeks. So if we didn't even get as much of the funny Ryan on today's episode, but I promise he's in there.
If this is on video, you can see I'm funny looking, but
That's true. But thanks so much for joining us on today's show.
great. Good to see you, Michael.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, write us a review, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.